Welcome to another new series. This series is on sleeves. I'm going to teach you how to draft many sleeves. And the very first sleeve is a very popular sleeve from the show Bridgerton. This sleeve has darts in it, 5 darts that fan out. It's very puffy, so the cap is lifted and it has a ruffle inside it. I'll show you how to draft the pattern. I'll show you the special things to do to sew it. If you have a personal sloper and it includes a sleeve, you can use that sleeve as your basis to start. If you do not, but you have a pattern that you're happy with, a dress pattern, and you like the fit of the armhole, use those measurements, the front armhole measurement and the back armhole measurement, minus any seam allowance. Then you can follow my basic sleeve pattern to get your template to start with. I'll leave a link in the description box to that video. First, I made a tracing of my personal sleeve sloper, and I believe this sleeve is about 1 inch above the elbow. So first, I will take that inch off. As it stands, the sleeve is tapered somewhat. The Bridgerton sleeve has darts in it, and I want to have enough room in here to create those beautiful darts. I'm going to make this line perpendicular, giving me a little more width. I'm going to make slash lines so I can make it larger, and all the fullness will go in this area. We virtually never put any fullness under here because from the notches down is the underarm area. The grain line is in the middle of the sleeve, so I'll start with this as my first slash. I'm going to put 7 slashes. I'm going to put slashes 1 inch apart. And I'm going to number these so I don't lose track of where I am. And cut it out. On a fresh piece of paper, create my grain lines. I took the arm measurement that I believe will work for me, and I added the 6.5 inches to make all the darts. And for me, it came to 15.5. So along this baseline, I'm marking 15.5. So I start my plot with the end pieces being butted up against here, matching my grain lines. And I'll tape this down. And these get spread evenly. If you spread the outer ones evenly and then there's a discrepancy, you can use that right in the middle. What I need to do now is lift the top. It looks to me like it was lifted approximately 1.5 inches. This will give me a little more working space. So I'm going to say there is the top of my sleeve. And this all gets blended back into the underarms. So what I often do is first freehand it. And if you have to cut the corners off of this is fine. This would normally blend in together. To make the darts, I want to take these pieces off simply because it'll be easier to see what I'm doing. So that's 1, 2, 3, and they are 1.5 inches each. 1 1/2 times 3 equals 4.5. And then 2 smaller ones, 2 times 1 equals 2. 6.5 inches plus your arm's circumference. And that should do it. My first dart is in the dead center of the sleeve. And I'm going to make it 3/4 of an inch deep, so it's 3/4 on either side. So this is a dart. I'll come over maybe 3/8 of an inch and do my second dart. And then finally, my last dart will be an inch. Okay, that's a perfect measurement for me. This way, there are no darts under the arms. This is the underarm curve, so there are no darts under the arm. And if this area is a little bit too loose for you, you can take it in here without disturbing this. So I think that looks good. My first dart, I think, comes to just under the bicep from the photograph. It doesn't really matter, but that's what I think it is. And then the second ones would be an inch shorter approximately, and the smaller ones here. They also look a little bit like they fan out to me. So I'm going to do this. First, draw them in. So what I'm doing is the tip, I'm measuring the tip from the center red line so that they're equidistant. And then this one, first I just kind of eyeball it, I think right about there. Trace this all onto tracing paper. I prefer to fold on the tracing paper and make my mistakes there and then transfer them back without mistakes. Here's my tracing, the 5 darts. I want them all to be facing to the back of the sleeve. This is the back part of the sleeve, this is the front. To do that, I am going to fold on the dart leg closest to the back in each case and fold it toward the front, and that will automatically make the dart go to the back. First, crease on the dart leg, put your finger at the tip and pull it over like that. They're not going to meet at the bottom because they're shaped, and I'll pin these together. As you can see, it's terribly uneven at the bottom, so I need to blend all this together, not cutting up into the darts, but going below them, and then make a facing. While it's pinned together, I'm going to mark at the bottom of each dart. That will help me with notches later, and I'm going to add seam allowance before I cut this out. I'm going to add 1/4 inch seam allowance along the bottom edge. That way I do not have to go back and trim this. If the fabric was loosely woven fabric and frayed easily, I would create a deeper seam allowance. And I'm going to put 1/2 inch up the sides. And with a scrap of tracing paper, pin this down. It's easy to flip-flop. This shape on this side is slightly different than this side. It's good to have at least one notch other than where the grain line is. I'm making this a fraction more than 1 1/4 when it's finished, so I can turn this top edge down slightly if I want to. Put this aside and reveal these shapes. Isn't that fun? When you fold something and cut it like that, we call this cording, like an accordion. So now to transfer this back to the sleeve. Now what I do is I lay this tracing paper on top of the sleeve, lining up everything and securing it down, and carefully trace this onto my final pattern. Extend your notches and cut it out. The last thing I need to do is make the ruffle that goes in the cap inside the sleeve. And I believe it's going to go from about here to here. It's about 7 inches at the most. And I believe it looks to be about 1.5 inches wide. If from this area to this area is 7 inches and I want it to be gathered, I think about 2.5 times that length would be great. So I'll make it 18 inches. This is cut on the bias. I take a 2-inch square here and put a dot at the opposite ends, and this will be my length grain line. Length grain line, and cross grain is perpendicular. This will be folded when it's in fabric, and the edges will be curved, so you can just cut it like this. As a recap for our ruffle, I wanted it to be 1.5 inches wide. So here's 1.5 inches and a fold line and 1.5 inches, and then the seam allowance around all the edges. The edges are curved because when it's stitched, the stitching lines do this. They come around here, and then a second one and a third one, and you gather all of this up to be a ruffle, as you will see. Here's our pattern, our sleeve, our facing, and the ruffle. To make what I call a couture dart, where you have no knot, you take the bobbin thread and you thread it backwards through the needle, tie it on to the top thread, make sure it's nice and tight, and pull the bobbin thread up through the machine, a little more than the length of the dart that you're sewing. Pin your dart down and start at the tip. Normally you would start at the base, the widest part of the dart. Put your needle very, very close to the edge. What's really happening is the bobbin is threaded up, so you're sewing with one thread instead of two. Stitch your dart. Make sure it's nice and tight at the bottom. What I do is I hold it in place and stitch several times. Let's take a look at the sleeve. Before I started sewing the sleeve, I did a very tight stitch from the notches down on either side, and I ran 3 rows of gathering stitches around the cap. I always like 3 or 4 rows, better than 2. I did a French seam. Once I sewed the facing on, I did not want it to fall down. So on the inside, by hand, I stitched the seam allowance to the outside of the facing. You see these tiny stitches. To handle the facing, after I did the understitching, I folded the facing down on top of the seam allowance like this, and then folded the facing up. And I stitched it with tiny, tiny stitches about every 1/2 inch, which you really cannot see from the outside. The facing actually was too wide to do that without some bulk, so I also clipped it like this. So as it turns on, the little clips can fold together. And right here, where the darts are, I actually made a little pleat of the excess facing. So now from the outside, you don't see the seam allowance and you don't see the bulk or the stitches of the facing. The ruffle I sewed independently, and I used a piece of twill tape and stitched it through and through just the ruffle. Through and through means through all layers of the ruffle only, to keep it from stretching out of shape. And then I laid it inside the sleeve. You can do one of 2 things. You can sew your sleeve in the garment first and then add the ruffle, or you can sew the ruffle to the sleeve and insert the whole thing together. Thank you for joining me, and see you next time.